0.1 kilometers per hour. That's the number that got Lewis Hamilton penalized this season. Not a crash, not a dangerous move. 0.1 kilometers per hour over a pit lane limit. A margin so small that most speed guns on a residential street wouldn't even flag it. And when Fred Vasseur was asked about it, he didn't make excuses. He said, quote, "When the weekend is going in the wrong direction, 0.1 kilometers per hour is a big delta, and we took the penalty." And that single sentence tells you everything about the mood inside Ferrari right now. But here's what almost nobody outside the paddock caught. Buried in a technical report that barely made headlines, it turns out Formula One management's own timing barriers at Monaco had been physically shifted by 77 centimeters, not adjusted on paper, physically moved, which means the exact point where speed was being calculated wasn't where the system assumed it was. And if that's true, this isn't a story about one unlucky penalty anymore. This is a story about whether the numbers deciding a Formula One World Championship can actually be trusted. Before we go through every single incident and show you exactly how they connect, hit subscribe right now, because the FIA is eventually going to have to answer for this. And when they do, we'll be covering it before anyone else. So let's break this whole thing down from the beginning. Every driver on the grid has a race that means more than the others. For Lewis Hamilton, that's Silverstone, his home race, the one with his name on the grandstand, his face on the flags, decades of history behind every corner. It's the race where a driver is supposed to feed off the crowd and deliver something special. Instead, Hamilton left Silverstone with two separate marks against his name in the same weekend, and the details of both are still being argued about. The first was a false start penalty. Stewards handed him a 5-second time penalty for allegedly creeping forward on the grid before the lights went out. Standard stuff in theory. False starts happen. And when they do, the penalty is usually uncontroversial because the data is usually obvious. A car either moves or it doesn't. Except in this case, Ferrari's own sensors detected nothing. No movement, not a flicker. It was only when stewards went back and studied onboard camera footage frame by frame that they found something. A tire rotation measuring just 42 millimeters. For context, that's less than the width of an adult hand. The kind of movement that could come from wind, from vibration, from the natural flex of a loaded tire sitting still under braking pressure. Vasseur wasn't having it. He told the media directly, quote, "You are a bit harsh," rejecting the idea that this was a legitimate infraction. He went further, explaining exactly why the decision troubled him. Quote, "The sensors say the car did not move on the grid." He acknowledged that yes, technically, you could see a tiny dot shift on the tire if you paused the footage at the right frame, but he still called it, quote, "a harsh decision when the sensors do not detect movement." Think about what that actually means. Ferrari is one of the most technologically advanced teams in the sport. Their sensors are precise enough to detect tire pressure changes measured in tenths of a PSI, brake temperatures down to single degrees, aerodynamic load shifts most fans will never fully understand, and those same sensors, the ones trusted to fine-tune a car worth tens of millions of dollars, detected nothing. Yet a 5-second penalty was applied anyway, based on a visual review of 42 millimeters of movement. That's penalty number 1. On the same day, in the same race, penalty number 2 arrived, this time for allegedly failing to respond properly to a yellow flag at turn 9, after Nico Hülkenberg's car came to a stop on track. On paper that sounds like a simple case. Yellow flag conditions require drivers to slow down, full stop, no gray area. But the actual sequence of events was messier than that. The warning that should have appeared on Hamilton's steering wheel display did not show up when he entered the yellow flag zone. It appeared late, and despite that delay, despite the fact that the very system meant to inform him of the danger failed to do its job in real time, stewards still ruled that once the warning did appear, he hadn't slowed down enough. So in the span of one single race weekend, at his home Grand Prix, Hamilton picked up 2 penalties, one built on a 42mm tire rotation his own team's sensors couldn't detect, the other built on a warning system that told him too late. Vasseur, reflecting on what this was doing to his driver and to the wider team, used a phrase that has since become one of the most repeated lines of the season. He said the pressure builds, quote, "small stone after small stone." Individually, each penalty looks minor, a 5-second time penalty here, a few seconds there, nothing that changes a championship on its own. But stacked together, race after race, they start to weigh on everything. A driver's confidence, a team's in-race strategy, and ultimately the entire trajectory of a title fight. If Silverstone had been an isolated incident, this would be a very different story. One bad weekend happens to every driver eventually, but the pattern didn't stop. It continued at Spa, and it continued again at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and by that point it stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like something else entirely. Spa added another data point to a growing list, and whatever your view on the specifics of that incident, the timing mattered. Coming off the back of 2 contentious Silverstone penalties, any additional marginal call was always going to be viewed through a different lens, not just by Ferrari, but by fans and media who were already starting to ask questions about consistency. Then came Hungary, and this is where Vasseur's patience visibly ran out in public. Hamilton was penalized for a pit lane speeding infraction. The overage, 0.1 kilometers per hour, the pit lane limit was 80 km/h. The FIA's own data had Hamilton at 80.5, Ferrari's telemetry showed 80.6. Either way you look at it, the margin between legal and penalized was smaller than the rounding error most speed measuring devices carry as standard tolerance. This is where Vasseur delivered what's now known as the same basket comment, a moment where he laid out in plain terms exactly how absurd the margin was. He revealed the numbers publicly, the limit, the FIA's reading, Ferrari's own reading, all sitting within a fraction of a single kilometer per hour of each other. And then came the quote that's been repeated everywhere since, quote, "When the weekend is going in the wrong direction, 0.1 kilometers per hour is a big delta, and we took the penalty." On the surface, that sounds like a team accepting a decision gracefully. Dig one layer deeper, and it reads very differently. It's a team saying, "We know this is absurd, we know the margin is functionally meaningless, but we've learned that fighting these calls doesn't work. So we're taking the hit and moving on even though we don't believe it's fair." That's not acceptance, that's exhaustion. And then came the detail that turned this from Ferrari having a rough season into a full-blown credibility question for the sport itself. It emerged quietly, buried in technical reports that most fans never saw and most outlets never covered in depth, that Formula One management's own timing system at Monaco had a flaw. The pit entry barriers had been physically modified at some point, shortening the measurement line by 77 centimeters. 77 centimeters doesn't sound like much until you understand what it actually does to a timing system. Speed through a pit lane isn't measured with a radar gun pointed at a car in isolation. It's calculated using fixed measurement points and the time it takes a car to travel between them. Shift one of those points without recalibrating the entire system around the new distance, and every calculation downstream becomes slightly wrong. Not wildly wrong, but wrong enough that a car traveling at a genuinely legal speed can be flagged as marginally over the limit, when in reality it never crossed the true threshold at all. Once this detail started circulating properly among journalists and technical analysts who actually understood what it meant, the entire narrative around Hamilton's 2026 season flipped. This wasn't a story about a driver having bad luck anymore. This was a story about whether the systems policing every Formula One race, the systems that hand out time penalties capable of deciding a world championship, are actually measuring what they claim to measure. That's the moment Fred Vasseur stopped being diplomatic. Up until this point, virtually every quote out of Vasseur carried a tone of frustrated acceptance. "We have to accept it," he said after the false start penalty at Silverstone, resigned to the reality that stewards don't always explain their reasoning in detail, and that Ferrari's only real option was to move on and focus on the next race. But once the timing line discrepancy became public knowledge, that tone shifted entirely. People inside the paddock have described him as visibly stunned when the full picture was laid out in front of him. Not race by race the way it had been unfolding in real time, but all at once, 6 separate incidents under FIA scrutiny across a single season, all connected, at least in part, by a thread of measurement inconsistency and marginal calls that shouldn't have been enough to trigger a penalty in the first place. Vasseur wasn't the only one whose tone changed. Listen closely to what Hamilton himself said over team radio during the Hungarian Grand Prix, and it's not just frustration, it's something closer to disbelief, he told his engineer, quote, handing out penalties like crazy, not a throwaway complaint, a pointed observation, delivered in the moment, with no filter and no media training softening the language. After the race, he doubled down with an even sharper statement, quote, every opportunity that I give those stewards, every single time they give me a penalty. Put that quote next to the Monaco timing line revelation, and it stops sounding like a driver making excuses for a mediocre season. It starts sounding like a driver who may have genuinely been right the entire time, who sensed something was off before anyone had the technical evidence to back it up. That's an important distinction. Athletes complain about officiating in every sport all the time, and most of the time it's noise, frustration in the moment that fades by the next event. But when a 7-time world champion, someone with nothing left to prove and no reputation left to build, starts saying the same thing race after race, and then hard technical evidence emerges supporting exactly what he'd been saying, that's not noise anymore, that's a pattern worth taking seriously. Here's why this story carries so much weight. If even one of these 6 penalties turns out to have been based on flawed measurement data, that changes race results, that changes championship points, and in a title fight where Hamilton currently sits 50 points behind Kimi Antonelli after Hungary, every single point matters more than in almost any other season in recent memory. 50 points sounds enormous on paper, the kind of gap that effectively ends a championship conversation before the second half of the season even begins. But strip away even 2 or 3 of these 6 penalties. Recalculate the track positions Hamilton would have held without them. Factor in the points he would have scored instead of lost. And that gap suddenly looks very different. Maybe not closed entirely. That would be an oversimplification, but no longer the insurmountable wall it currently appears to be on the standings sheet. That's the difference between Ferrari's season is over, and Ferrari's season depends on what the FIA decides to do next. Right now, the paddock is dividing into 2 very distinct camps, and both sides have a genuine point. On one side, you have people who believe this is simply the reality of modern Formula One. The margins have always been tight, and precision is part of the sport at this level. If the limit is 80 kilometers per hour, then 81 is technically over that limit. No matter how small the difference feels to a casual observer, rules are rules. From this perspective, Ferrari and Hamilton need to be more precise, not more vocal. Complaining about measurement systems after the fact doesn't change the fact that a limit was crossed. However, marginally, on the other side, a growing number of voices, including respected members of the media and several former drivers, are asking a much more uncomfortable question. If the equipment measuring these infractions has already been proven wrong once, at Monaco, with a documented 77-centimeter timing line shift, how confident can anyone actually be that every other penalty issued this season has been correctly calculated? Once you know the measuring stick itself can be flawed, every reading it's produced becomes fair game for scrutiny. That question alone, not the penalties themselves, but the credibility of the systems behind them, is enough to make this one of the most significant off-track storylines of the entire 2026 championship. When Vasseur was pressed further on whether Ferrari has built any part of its season strategy around simply managing Hamilton and these penalties, he pushed back hard against the suggestion that the team is just making excuses. Instead, he insisted the pattern reflects something structural, a broader issue with how the sport's stewarding interacts with increasingly sensitive and apparently not always accurate timing technology. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first glance. If this were genuinely isolated to Hamilton, if it were simply a case of one driver being unlucky or careless, then the story stays contained to Ferrari's garage. But if this really is systemic, a genuine structural flaw in how modern stewarding decisions interact with fine-margin timing data, then this story doesn't end with Hamilton at all. Every driver on the grid could eventually be affected by the exact same issue, which means this isn't just a Ferrari story or a Hamilton story anymore. It's potentially a story about the entire sport's ability to trust its own instruments. With the championship gap sitting at 50 points and 12 races still remaining on the calendar, every governing body decision from this point forward is going to be scrutinized under a microscope by fans, by journalists, and by rival teams who now have a very specific, very technical reason to question whether the numbers on their timing screens can actually be trusted. Formula One has been through credibility crises before. There have been moments where fans lost faith in race control, in steward consistency, in whether the sport's officiating could keep pace with its own technology, and every single time the sport survived, but only because the governing body was eventually forced into transparency. Clarifications got published, procedures got adjusted. In rare cases, records got quietly corrected once enough pressure built up publicly. The pressure building around this timing line issue has all the hallmarks of exactly that kind of moment. And this isn't happening to some small backmarker team that can be dismissed or ignored. This is Ferrari, the most historic name in the sport, fighting for its first title in years, paired with a 7-time world champion who has nothing left to prove and every incentive to speak the truth publicly rather than manufacture excuses for a disappointing season. A legendary team, a legendary driver, and hard technical evidence, all pointing in the same direction. That combination is exactly the kind of pressure that tends to force governing bodies to respond, whether they want to or not. So the coming weeks during this summer shutdown might not just be about Ferrari's internal preparation for the second half of the season. They might also be about whether the FIA quietly reviews its own systems before Zandvoort. Because right now, silence is starting to look a lot more damaging than an actual explanation would be. If the FIA does open a review, there are really only a few paths forward. They could acknowledge the Monaco timing discrepancy publicly, audit the affected sessions, and in the most dramatic scenario, retroactively adjust penalties tied directly to flawed measurements. That would be almost unprecedented for a sport that has historically been reluctant to revisit decisions once a race weekend is over. Alternatively, they could quietly fix the physical timing line issue going forward without formally addressing the earlier penalties at all, treating it as a technical correction rather than an admission that past decisions were flawed. That path avoids the messy precedent of reopening championship-relevant results, but it does little to answer the credibility question that's now been raised in public. Or the FIA could simply stay silent and hope the story fades over the summer break, based on how this has already spread among journalists, technical analysts, and fans who understand exactly what a shifted timing line means for every calculation downstream. That third option looks increasingly unlikely to work. So here's what we want to know from you, and we mean this seriously. If it turns out that flawed timing equipment genuinely cost Lewis Hamilton championship points this season, do you think the FIA has a responsibility to review and potentially reverse those decisions? Or once a penalty is applied during a race weekend, should it simply stand, no matter what evidence comes out afterward? Drop your take in the comments right now, because this debate is only going to get louder as more technical details continue to come out. And if you want to be here the moment the FIA actually responds to this growing pressure, whether they double down, stay silent, or admit fault, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications immediately, because we're going to be covering every single update on this story before anyone else does. Like this video if you think this bombshell deserves more attention than it's been getting so far. Share it with any F1 fan who's been following Hamilton's rough season and needs to see the full picture. And I'll see you in the next one.